front line, with Russia in economic crisis and tensions simmering over Ukraine, the world is watching Vladimir Putin.
When he's in the corner, that's when he's dangerous.
Tonight, the inside story of the Russian president's rise to power.
He has got so many guilty secrets, so much money's been stolen that he doesn't really trust anyone to keep him safe if he steps down from power.
Correspondent Gillian Findley investigates the allegations that have haunted Putin.
There have been a number of credible investigations.
All this propagandistic quasi-investigation don't become victim of propaganda.
If you put these people in the United States and check what they've done, they're criminals.
Tonight on Frontline.
Instead of seeing Russia as a democracy in the process of failing, we need to see it as an authoritarian system in the process of succeeding.
Putin's way. In the spring of 2012, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin entered the Kremlin to start his third term as president of Russia. It had been a remarkable ascent. In just over 20 years, a journey from unemployed spy to modern-day czar. Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Zhikov has watched that climb to power. A former police investigator who once wanted to arrest Putin, he says his rise has come at great cost.
В принципе, коррупция, конечно, в России была всегда.
Well, of course, there has always been corruption in Russia, but building it into such a meticulous system was something only Mr. Putin has managed to do.
Скажем так, можно ли на основании той базы, которая уже находилась?
Could Putin be held criminally responsible based on the evidence that has already been gathered? Absolutely, yes.
Безусловно, да.
In 2010, Zhikov laid out evidence he had gathered from an investigation of Putin's early years in city government in St. Petersburg. He posted it on YouTube. Mysteriously, there have been efforts to delete it from the web, but not before it was downloaded by Russia expert and author Karen DeWisha.
And in its essence, what did that series that he posted, what was the summation of it? The summation of it was a detailed account of the criminal activities that he feels Putin was involved in. Abuse of power, abuse of his official position, involvement in relations with organized crime, knowledge about money laundering. I mean, a whole range of economic crimes.
DeWisha says that Zhikov's charges are part of a larger culture of corruption in Putin's Russia. She has been gathering extensive documentation for a new book on what she calls Putin's kleptocracy and how he and his circle have shaped the country.
I started thinking, instead of seeing Russia as a democracy in the process of failing, we need to see it as an authoritarian system in the process of succeeding. That they're not actually incapable of being Democrats. They don't want to be Democrats. What about that? Let's work on that thesis. And if that's correct, when did that start? And that's what took me to the 90s, because they were stealing from the very beginning.
In 1990, the old Soviet system was collapsing. But what exactly would replace it wasn't clear. The uncertainty had a whole nation on edge. Among them was a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. He'd returned to his hometown of St. Petersburg from his posting in Dresden, East Germany, and he was looking for work. He would eventually find it at St. Petersburg's City Hall. His former law professor, Anatoly Sobchak, had just been elected mayor. Sobchak's widow, Lyudmila Narasova, remembers her husband's response when his former student insisted on telling him that he'd been working for the KGB.
My husband was shocked by the candor and asked what his job was. And he said he had worked in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany. And he said, well, I just happen to be looking for people that know Europe, that know the languages in order to work on foreign economic relations. They wouldn't have hired an idiot to work in reconnaissance, so I hope you can manage it. Go work. And it needs to be said that, according to my husband, he never regretted it.
Putin would soon be deputy mayor of the city, and crucially, chair of the Committee on Foreign Economic Relations.
He was the linchpin. He controlled which foreign companies could register their offices and receive offices. After all, remember, all this property was Soviet property. Soviet Union hadn't fallen yet. So how was a company going to get access to property to set up a branch in St. Petersburg? Putin would have to assign it.
Even as his star rose, there was an early example of his ambition. He commissioned a documentary about himself. It was called Power, made by Igor Shadkan.
Но у Путина была определенная цель.
Putin had an agenda. He wanted to admit that he had been a KGB agent in foreign reconnaissance.
Но он занимался внешней разведкой.
После окончания университета мне было предложено прийти на работу в органы Комитета государственной безопасности.
For Putin, it was an effective way to out himself as a former member of the reviled KGB. But for Mayor Sobchak, Putin's past would prove useful. After all, he was running a city with a notorious criminal history, and according to prominent political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky, he needed someone who could work in its shadows.
St. Petersburg called the bandit capital of Russia, gangster capital of Russia, at that moment. And the mayor's office should communicate to those groupings some way. But of course, Anatoly Sobchak could not be involved in such contacts. And it was Vladimir Putin who was in charge.
Когда я, кстати говоря, пришел к нему на съемку, то полная приемная его.
When I arrived for the shoot, his entire lobby was full of foreigners. These included Finnish, Germans, and there was some agreement they were all coming to. Now, the agreement for the most part was about food aid for St. Petersburg.
Putin had his work cut out for him. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought terrible food shortages to St. Petersburg. The agricultural system was in chaos, and there was little foreign currency to buy food from abroad. To fill the shelves, a program was devised. Companies would be allocated raw materials like oil and minerals to be sold abroad, and the money was then used to buy food. In his film, the deputy mayor assured hungry residents food was on its way.
Масло животного 2,2 тысяч тонн, молока сухого 2,000 тонн. Значит, это фактически перекрывает все наши потребности. Но это впечатляет, я могу сказать откровенно.
They were telling me, don't dig into it, otherwise you will get imprisoned yourself. And then specifically they were telling me in a straightforward way, just leave it if you don't want to have trouble. And I was saying that, well, I'm the former investigator and I have experience and I can help. I can run my own investigation.
But there would be many obstacles placed in the way of an investigation.
The Russian government destroyed all the evidence in the case of the earlier bombings. No sooner had the bombings taken place than bulldozers showed up to remove the rubble, including human remains. And in that case, they destroyed the crime scene.
But the troubling questions about the bombings were really fueled by what happened here, a few days later, in a town outside Moscow called Ryazan.
A fifth bomb was discovered in the basement of an apartment building in Ryazan by watchful inhabitants of that building. And that bomb was defused. And the people who had placed that bomb in the basement turned out to be not Chechen terrorists. They turned out to be agents of the FSB, the Russian security service.
Tests showed that the bags contained an exclusive military explosive called hexagon. The detonator, too, was military.
I think that the evidence that there was an FSB operation to place explosives in the apartment building in Ryazan is incontrovertible.
At the time, the FSB claimed the Ryazan operation was part of a training exercise. But the broader conclusion that security services could have killed their own people in the other apartments was dismissed by the government. In his biography, Putin called it utter nonsense, totally insane. No Chechens were ever charged. Others arrested were convicted in secret trials, and still others in trials tainted by allegations of forced confessions. But all along, it's been disturbingly dangerous to investigate too closely.
People who tried to investigate the apartment bombings, in many cases ended up dead. Yuri Shekhatyikhin, Sergei Yushchenko, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya.
Sergei Markov is a political analyst and often speaks for Vladimir Putin.
There have been a number of credible investigations that have concluded that this was the work of the FSB and could not have happened without the knowledge of Mr. Putin.
It was no one credible investigation which shows that it had been done by FSB. All this propagandistic quasi-investigation, just using tricks and so on. I already heard about this story, about this FSB exploded the building in the Moscow maybe hundreds of times. And all these people free, nobody was in jail. Don't become victim of propaganda. It's very dangerous also.
There were 3 attempts in the Russian Duma to investigate the events in Ryazan. In all cases, they were voted down, or with the ruling party under Putin's control voting unanimously not to investigate and not to ask questions.
Mikhail Trepashkin was asked to help with one of those Duma investigations. A week before he was due to report his findings, he was stopped by the police.
So they stopped me at a police checkpoint where there was a crowd of people. They checked my identification twice and checked the car, and they didn't find anything. And when I was closing it, one of the officers threw in a bag, and I told him, "That's not mine. Why are you putting that in my car?" He opened the bag and said, "Here is the gun. Here is the gun." And I was immediately arrested.
Trepashkin was sent to prison for 2 years. He came out and again spoke about his investigation of the apartment bombings and was arrested and jailed for